As pilots of light aircraft, it seems we're always battling the elements, and when I see those really popular videos on YouTube showing airliners crabbing against strong crosswinds or being bounced around by turbulence on final, it makes me laugh, because the pilot always gets lauded for their skills, but for us, this is all pretty standard affair.
Well, that wind is strong. Got Charlie Zulu, final 20.
Charlie Zulu, thanks, 260 degrees, 27 knots.
Charlie Zulu.
So join me today as we take a look at crosswind and bumpy approach techniques in a little aircraft. Welcome to Shortfield, the channel all about the lighter side of aviation. And today we're having a look at dealing with unfavourable winds on the approach and landing in a small aircraft. In an ideal world, the wind will always be a gentle breeze steadily blowing straight down the runway every time we were going flying. But it's not an ideal world, and if you just flew in perfect conditions, in the UK at least, you wouldn't get much flying done. Ab initio training is generally practiced in benign conditions, but it's only once you get your licence and start to venture out on your own that your crosswind and turbulence acceptance envelope starts to expand. But many pilots still find crossy, bumpy days intimidating, especially with lack of practice. So I thought you might be interested in how our little Piper Sport copes with windy days. A safe landing always starts with a stabilised approach. This is achieved when the aircraft is configured for landing at the correct approach speed, angle and descent rate, and aligned with the runway, with minimal power adjustments and control inputs to maintain the path all the way to the runway by the time you get to a target altitude or point.
Okay, we're stabilised.
The target should be set at a point where, if not stabilised, a safe go around can be completed, and it can be over the end of the runway if it happens to be as long as the airfield that I operate from at North Weald. On a calm day, maintaining a stable approach is pretty straightforward. But once you throw in an element of crosswind and or low-level turbulence into the situation, maintaining that stable approach requires more dynamic control and throttle inputs, which some pilots find uncomfortable, especially close to the ground and at low airspeed. Most approaches start with probably the most dangerous manoeuvre in aviation, the turn from base onto final. You need to anticipate any wind, especially with a strong crosswind, which may try to blow you through the centre line. If it does, don't be tempted to pull the aircraft around with high degrees of bank. If this happens to me, I will add some power and unload the wings by allowing the nose to drop. And I'll make my approach at a slightly lesser angle, trying to get back onto the extended centre line a bit later on final, but before any stabilised approach target point. If it looks like I'm not going to get it aligned with the runway, I'll just go around and try again.
Charlie Zulu, final 27.
Oh, Charlie Zulu.
Wind check, please.
It's variable, I'm afraid. It's best bet is about 350, 340, and only about 5 knots, 6 knots.
Okay, let's give it 23 knots soon.
Really?
If you're flying into an airfield with a radio service, if they pass you the wind conditions, be wary, as they may not be taking them at the area of the runway you are going to land on, and conditions may be better or worse than the report. Look at the windsock and see how it's moving. This will give you a good idea of any trend. If it's all over the place, you can expect turbulent conditions on the ground. The key to landing safely in a gusty crosswind is exactly the same as landing with a light wind. Your aim is to lock onto the runway centre line, or the runway if it's unmarked, keeping that point at the same place in relation to the aircraft all the way down the approach. In the little Piper Sport, with its lightweight and low momentum, sometimes you really do have to fight to keep it aligned and at the right attitude and speed, especially in turbulence. But once stabilised on final, it's just a case of feeling the wind and just fixating on that centre line and your touchdown aiming point. There's two taught methods for crosswind landings: The wing down or side slip method, which requires a bank into the wind with correction or alignment being applied with opposite rudder, or my preferred technique of crabbing. Once I turn on to final and line up with the runway, I'll be able to see what I have to do with the rudder pedals to yaw into the wind and keep the aircraft travelling along the extended centreline. Even if I've not seen the windsock or been past the report, I can feel the wind's effects on the aircraft. I don't worry about how the aircraft is travelling through the air. All I do is adjust my power and rudder to just keep the touchdown zone and centre line aligned in my view, as if it were a regular approach with no wind. If I hit turbulence, I'll correct with ailerons and some throttle, but my only goal is to maintain the picture, just as we were taught in flight school. Often the wind can be really strong for most of the approach, but if there's any trees or sheltered areas near the touchdown zone, it can become much lighter and may even be blowing in a slightly different direction. If the crosswind is particularly strong or gusty, I won't apply any flaps and I fly the approach about 10% faster than I normally would.
Birds down there.
Once I'm committed to the landing, I'll maintain the crab until I start the flare, at which point I will transition the aircraft into the flare by arresting the sink with the elevator and at the same time removing the power and yaw to keep aligned with the centre line. I'll also start a bank with the ailerons into wind to try and touch down on the into wind main wheel first, keeping the aircraft running along the centre line with the rudder. Once on the deck, I keep adding aileron into wind to stop being blown sideways as the aircraft slows.
Right, wind's from the right.
The demonstrated crosswind component in the Piper Sports POH is just 12 knots, but is more than capable of dealing with a lot more. It may have a low mass, but the Piper Sport has a powerful rudder and ailerons which can overcome crosswinds over 20 knots, even with a touchdown speed of less than 45 knots. Which, when you think about it, is nearly 50% crosswind component. That's like an airliner landing at 120 knots in a 50 knot crosswind.
Well, that wind is strong. Got Charlie Zulu, final 20.
Charlie Zulu, thanks, 260 degrees, 27 knots.
Charlie Zulu.
Crosswinds are a fact of life for the pilot, and nothing gives you greater pleasure than nailing a good landing in one. But remember, these skills are learned and you need to go practice as much as possible and take an instructor if the wind is beyond your normal limits. So that does it for this time. What's your crosswind limit and has it increased over time, or are you still training or newly qualified and finding it difficult to control the aircraft in turbulence or crosswinds? Please pop your comments in the section below. I'd love to hear about your thoughts, experiences or recommendations, and I try to read every comment. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you found this video interesting, but please note I'm not an instructor. This is all based on my personal experience as a private pilot in the UK. Fly safe guys, and Shortfield out.